She felt it the way you feel, a door close in a room you cannot leave. Not the slam, not the sound, just the air changing, and the quiet, terrible knowledge that something which was open is now sealed. Seleneva Ashenvale was grinding dried thorn root when it happened. Her hands were moving in slow, practiced circles, the stone pestle turning against the bowl, the sharp green scent of the herb rising in thin curls around her fingers. The lower helary was small and warm. Bundles of dried lavender and black root hung from the ceiling beams. A single oil lamp burned on the corner shelf. The fire in the grate had been fed an hour ago and was holding steady, amber and low. It was the kind of room that felt safe. It had always felt safe. And for nearly a year, it had been the one place in the enormous, echoing fortress of Kyrox Stormclaw, where Seleneva had allowed herself to feel like she belonged somewhere. Then the bond shifted. It did not break. It did not snap like a rope pulled past its limit. It simply moved. The way a flame moves when a window opens somewhere in the house. A direction change. A turning away. The warmth that had always, quietly, pointed toward her hands, now pointing toward something else. Someone else. 3 floors above her, in the great ceremony hall, hung with gold and black banners, and the sound of drums and the weight of an entire kingdom watching, Kyrox Stormclaw was marking another woman. The pestle stopped. Seleneva looked down at her hands. They were trembling, just slightly. Just barely, the kind of trembling a person who has survived a long time alone learns to hide before anyone can see it. She set the pestle down, slowly. She did not shatter it against the wall, though something in her chest wanted to. She counted her own breaths. 1, 2, 3, until her hands were still. She untied her apron, folded it once, then again, and laid it across the workbench. She did not cry. 3 gestures. That was all. But those 3 gestures told the entire truth of who she was. A woman who had been surviving without a safety net for so long that falling apart was a luxury she had never once been able to afford. She gathered her worn healer's bag from beneath the workbench. She put on her traveling cloak. She moved through the servants' passage without rushing, without looking back, through the herb courtyard where the night air hit her face like cold water, and out through the outer gate of the eastern wall. And somewhere above her, but in a hall full of applause and candlelight, and the weight of 3 allied families celebrating an arrangement that was supposed to save an entire territory, Kyrox Stormclaw went very still. Because the bond just moved. It was heading northwest, away from the fortress, away from him, away from everything they had built in the dark over 11 quiet months. And it was moving fast. Hey, quick question. How are you feeling right now? Because I need to check on you before we go any further. Thank you so much for being here. It really means the world to me. It is essential that we get your support through subscriptions, likes, comments, and shares. So, if this story is already pulling at your heart, which I know it is, please hit that subscribe button, smash the like, and drop a comment telling us where you are watching from. It helps more than you know, thank you. Now let us get back to the story. The Thornvale Mountains didn't welcome travelers. They were not the kind of mountains that offered shelter easily. No gentle foothills, no gradual rise, just the sudden cold reality of stone and altitude and air that tasted like winter even in the middle of autumn. The trees that grew on the lower slopes were old and close together, their roots lifting from the ground in thick knots, their branches grown so dense that the moonlight came through in fragments, pieces of silver scattered across the path like something broken. Seleneva moved through them without slowing. She did not have a destination. She had a direction, a way, and that was enough for now. The bond stretched with every step she took. She could feel it pulling at the center of her chest. That warm, golden thread she had spent months trying not to think too directly about, because thinking about it required acknowledging what it meant, and acknowledging what it meant required facing how completely, quietly, and without permission it had changed her life. She pushed against it, willed it to thin. It held. Of course it held. Memory rose the way memory always does when you are trying very hard not to think about something, in pieces, uninvited, vivid, arriving in exactly the order most likely to devastate you. 11 months ago, past midnight, the Healery lamp burning low. She had heard the sound first, heavy boots on the lower corridor, measured and unhurried, the kind of stride that expected doors to open before it arrived. She had been alone at that hour, as she almost always was. The senior healers worked days, while the physicians worked in the upper infirmary near the guard barracks. Selenova Ashenvale worked in the lower Healery with the herb stores and the night cases, the guards who came in quietly with wounds they did not want recorded, the servants who needed care they could not afford to announce. She had looked up when the door opened. The man who came through it was large, taller than the doorframe required him to be careful of, broad across the shoulders in the specific way of wolves who have been shifting and running and fighting since childhood. He had dark hair that was still damp from something, a jaw that clearly knew the word tension, and a gash along his left forearm that had been pressed with a cloth and was bleeding through it slowly. Or he looked around the Healery with the expression of someone who had expected to be questioned and was already composing his answers. Then his eyes landed on Selenova, and whatever answer he had been composing seemed to lose its shape. She had not bowed. She would think about that later, would realize it was the first time in 3 years of serving in the fortress that she had forgotten to bow when a person of rank entered a room. But something about the way he came through the door, tired, damp, bleeding through a cloth, had made him look so thoroughly like an ordinary man that the bow simply did not arrive before she was already moving to the supply shelf. "Sit," she said, nodding at the workbench. A pause. Then the sound of a large man sitting on a workbench, with the particular caution of someone not used to being told where to sit. "Oh, I heard," he said, "that you don't ask questions." She was already reaching for the clean linen. "Only when the answers would help me treat the wound." She turned, took the cloth from his arm, looked at what was underneath. Clean cut. Straight edges. Whatever made it was sharp and precise, not a battle injury. This was something more deliberate. "Does it go deeper than it looks?" A moment of quiet. Then, very carefully, "The arm or everything else?" She looked up at him then. Really looked. And for just a moment, something passed between them. Not the bond. Not yet. Not for weeks. But the particular recognition between two people who have both learned to carry more than they show. "Start with the arm," she said. Something in the corner of his mouth moved. Not quite a smile. The shape of one, restrained. "Khan Selenova Ashenvale," he said. Not as a question, she realized, which meant he already knew her name, which was its own interesting thing. I know who you are," she said. "Hold still." He held still. She worked in silence. He did not speak again until she was finishing the binding, and then he said, quietly, not looking at her, "Nobody talks to me like this." "Like what?" "Like I'm the one who needs to be managed." She tied the final knot and stepped back. "You came in after midnight with a wound you didn't go to your physicians with. You clearly need to be managed." She began cleaning the instruments. The binding should hold for 3 days. Don't shift until it's sealed. He stood. He moved toward the door. And then he stopped. "Thank you," he said. She did not turn around. That's what the Healery is for. He left. She stood in the quiet for a long time afterward, listening to the sound of his footsteps fade, and told herself very firmly that whatever had just happened in this room had no significance whatsoever. She was exceptionally wrong. He came back 4 days later, and then 8 days after that, and then every week through the autumn, with injuries that grew progressively less dramatic. A bruised shoulder, a headache he claimed was from a tense advisory meeting, once an old scar on his ribs that had started aching in the cold, until even Selenova, who had been constructing very firm internal walls about the whole situation, had to acknowledge that the Alpha King of the Stormclaw territories was coming to the lower Healery in the hours when no one was watching, not because he needed treatment, but because he wanted to be somewhere that felt like this. They read. They talked about old wolf histories, the kind that nobody taught in formal training, because they were too complicated and too honest. He asked her questions, genuine ones, the kind that expected real answers, the kind she had not been asked in so long that responding to them felt like stretching a muscle she had almost forgotten she had. She asked him questions back, and he answered them, and she understood from the way he answered that he was not used to being asked. 3 months after the first night, a quiet evening in late autumn, a fire in the small grate, an old book of territorial histories open between them on the workbench that neither of them was reading anymore because they had stopped pretending the reading was the point. The bond formed. It was not dramatic. It did not announce itself. It simply arrived, like a key turning in a lock that had been waiting, without knowing it was waiting, for exactly that key. A sudden expansion, as if the room had lost all its walls. Warmth that was not from the fire. Something golden and certain, clicking into place in the center of her chest. They both went still. "That was not supposed to happen," she said, very carefully. "No," he said. The silence that followed was not uncomfortable. It was the silence of two people sitting with something true, giving it the space to simply exist before anyone started deciding what to do about it. She had spent the next 4 weeks telling herself it did not matter. He was the Alpha King of one of the largest wolf territories in the region. She was a healer's apprentice, with no pack name, no recorded bloodline, no political value whatsoever. Whatever they had built in the small, warm hours of the Healery, it was real. She could not pretend it wasn't real. The bond made denying it impossible. But real and possible were not the same thing. And when the rumor of the ceremony first moved through the fortress like cold water through stone, she had started saying it to herself every morning. Like a prayer she did not want to believe, but needed to keep repeating. "He is the Alpha King. You are nobody. Whatever lives between you in the dark does not survive the light." She had said it enough times that it almost felt like truth. Almost. Selenova was running now. She could feel the altitude increasing under her feet, the cold sharpening, the trees thinning at the edges of the first ridge. The fortress lights had disappeared behind her, and somewhere in the darkness the bond stretched and held and burned with a warmth she could not make herself stop feeling, and she hated it, and she loved it, in exactly the measure that only something utterly genuine can be hated and loved at once. She crested the ridge. Below her, the Thornvale Valley spread into darkness and winter stars. Above her, nothing but cold air and height, and the particular silence of a mountain that has no interest in human pain. She did not stop. She did not look back. She pressed her hand once to her chest, where the bond lived, and she felt it pulse against her palm, warm and persistent and entirely unbreakable. And she walked forward into the dark. The applause was still echoing when he understood what he had done. Dikairo's Stormclaw stood on the dais of the great ceremony hall, with Zorina Ravencrest's wrist in both hands, and the formal marking complete, and 300 wolves of the highest-ranking families in the territory, watching him with an expression of satisfaction, and a cold, heavy knowledge settling into his chest like water through fractured stone. She felt it, She had felt every word. He had believed, because Velor had told him to believe, because the logic had seemed sound in the poisoned way that careful, deliberate lies always seem sound when you are too afraid to question them, that the floors between the ceremony hall and the lower healery would be enough. That distance would muffle the bond. That Seleneva, practical and steady and heartbreakingly composed, would feel the shift and understand it was not a choice, or was never a choice, was the only way he could protect her from an elder council vote that Velor had presented as a death sentence. He had not understood that the bond does not care about flaws, and now the thread connecting him to her was moving, northwest, fast, carrying something from her side of the connection that he had never felt from her before. Not grief. He had felt her quiet sadness on difficult days, muted and carefully managed, the way all her emotions were carefully managed. This was not that. This was worse. This was the specific feeling of someone who has stopped expecting anything. Someone who has decided they are finished. He kept smiling. He shook hands. He accepted the toasts raised in his name. He spoke briefly and warmly with the representatives of the 3 allied families, who were flushed with wine and satisfaction, and the particular pleasure of people who have successfully arranged something. He performed the Alpha King with the mechanical, precise efficiency of a man who has been performing his entire life, while the person inside the performance watches from a very long distance away. The bond grew quieter with every passing minute. The thing in his chest grew louder. His captain, Arikson Shadow Fang, appeared at his left shoulder within 3 minutes of the ceremony's end, solid and dark-haired and steady in the way of someone who has stood beside a king long enough to read exactly when something is very wrong from the way he is holding his jaw. Arikson said nothing. He waited. Kyrox leaned close, low enough that no one nearby could carry it. She is moving northwest, into the Thorn Vale. I need every tracker we have in the field within 10 minutes. Arikson moved without a word, which was precisely why Kyrox had trusted him for 11 years. He went to her room before the trackers were even assembled. He told himself he was only checking. He did not entirely believe himself, but the lie was necessary to get his feet moving in the right direction without stopping in a corridor somewhere to deal with the full weight of what he was feeling, which was not something he could afford to do in a building full of 300 observant wolves. The lower corridor was quiet. The healery door was closed. Her room, a small plain space off the herb storage passage that she had made warm with a few books and a window herb box and a woven rug in dark green that she had clearly made herself, was not. The door was ajar, and the lamp was cold. The shelf above the bed, where she kept her small collection of plant specimens and the 2 or 3 items she had accumulated over years that mattered to her, was empty. Her worn healer's bag was gone. Her traveling cloak was gone. Every indication of her presence in the room, stripped away with the quiet efficiency of someone who decided there was nothing here worth leaving a mess for. He was about to leave when he saw the windowsill. 3 weeks ago, he had left something there. A sprig of dried mountain sage wrapped in a scrap of parchment from his own writing desk, with 3 words pressed in his handwriting, for the difficult days. He had left it in the early morning while she was working, because she had mentioned once, just once, not as a request, or simply as an observation, that mountain sage was the scent she associated with the first home she had ever felt safe in, which had been a settlement house in the northern reaches that she had left at 14 and never returned to. The sage was gone. She had left everything, and she had taken that. Something opened in his chest that he had spent 31 years learning to keep closed. Not grief, though it was made of the same material. Something older. The particular devastation of realizing that even in leaving, even in pain, even believing whatever she believed about why this was happening, she had taken the thing he gave her. because even then, even in this, she could not let go of what was real. He stood in the empty room for a long moment. Then he went to find Velor. Though the Eastern Advisory Chamber was warm and lamplit, and smelled of old maps and ink, the accumulated scent of 30 years of strategies drawn, and decisions made, and power managed by a man who had mistaken his skill at management for wisdom. Velor Grimwood was standing at the main table when Kyrox entered. He was a thin man, precise in his movements, with the kind of face that revealed only what it chose to: intelligent pale eyes, a careful stillness, hair gone silver at the temples in a way that he wore with the authority of someone who had decided age was a credential. He had served Kyrox's father before he served Kyrox. He had been saying, "I know what is best for this territory," in one form or another for 3 decades. And he had been right often enough that the times he was wrong had never quite accumulated into a reckoning. But until now, Kyrox closed the door. He did not sit. He stood in the center of the room and looked at the man who had managed him for most of his adult life, and said simply, "Where is she?" Velor set down the document he was holding. He clasped his hands behind his back. He used the tone of a person explaining something to someone who is upset, but will, shortly, be reasonable. "She has left the fortress grounds, my lord. I believe she understood the council vote." Kyrox's voice was even. "Show me the original record." A pause. "There is no need to revisit. Show me the record, Velor." The silence that followed was not the silence of a man finding the right words. It was the silence of a man whose construction, assembled with extraordinary care over many weeks, has been asked to bear a weight it was never actually designed to hold. It was shaped like an answer. Kyrox looked at him for a long moment. Then he turned and walked out without another word, leaving the silence to settle into whatever shape it needed to take. In the courtyard, 12 trackers were waiting in the cold air, breath rising in white plumes, eyes alert. Arikson stood at their front with the composed readiness of a man who has done difficult things on difficult nights before, and did not need a speech to prepare for another one. Kyrox handed his formal ceremony coat to Ariksen without a word. He stepped to the center of the courtyard. He shifted. His wolf rose through him the way it always did, not gradually, not with the struggle some wolves experienced, but in one clean surge, like a tide that had been waiting for permission. Large, darker than most, eyes burning gold in the animal form, which was unusual enough that the trackers around him took a half step back from pure instinct before they caught themselves. The bond pulled northwest. He ran. By day 3, the Thorn Veil was trying to make a point. Selenova was cold in the specific way of someone who has been cold long enough that the cold has stopped feeling dramatic and started feeling simply constant, a fact of the body, like hunger, like tiredness, like the bond that continued to pulse in her chest at odd hours without her permission. Her supplies were running low. The trail she had been following, a narrow hunter's path that curved northeast along the valley wall, had split twice in the morning, and she had chosen wrong at the second fork, and spent 2 hours retracing her steps through terrain that had no patience for errors. She was not afraid. She had never had the luxury of fear as a primary emotion. Fear was for people who had something soft to fall back on. What Seleneva had was the specific, practical focus of a person who has learned that survival requires attention to the next step, not the 100th. She heard them before she saw them, not the sound of wolves moving through wilderness. That was almost entirely silence, the patient, careful silence of predators who know that noise is a disadvantage. This was different. This was deliberate sound, the snap of a branch that could have been avoided, the shift of weight on loose stone, a particular kind of approach that was not careless, but was designed to be heard, because being heard was the point, because being heard was the first part of the threat. She stopped walking. She turned. 3 wolves stepped from the tree line into the narrow clearing. They had shifted back to human form, all 3 of them large, none of them young, wearing the particular expression of people who had decided before they arrived how this situation would resolve. Their leader was a man with a scar running from his left ear to his jaw and a smile that did not carry a single warm thing behind it. He looked at Selenova the way some people look at things that have been left unattended long enough to seem ownerless. "Lost?" he said. Selenova looked at the 3 of them. She did the calculation, the kind she had done many times in her life, in settlement houses and border towns and corridors where she was the smallest person in the room. Not can I win this? That was never the right question. The right question was, what position costs them the most? She shifted. She had shifted only a handful of times in her life. Her wolf was present the way a voice is present in someone who has never been given reason to speak, capable, untested, waiting for exactly the circumstance that made it necessary. It rose through her now without struggle. Her wolf was smaller than any of theirs, silver pale, low-slung, with eyes that were an unusual shade. Not gold like most, but something closer to starlight, which she had always found strange and never been able to explain. She planted her feet. She bared her teeth. The leader laughed. He took a step forward. Something dropped from the ridge above the clearing. It landed between Selenova and the 3 rogues with a sound like controlled collapse, a silver-grey wolf that shifted mid-movement with the ease of someone who had been doing this for so long that the mechanics of it had long ceased to require thought. What stood in the clearing 90 seconds later, after a sequence of events Selenova would later only be able to describe as decisive, was a man. He was perhaps 50 in appearance, perhaps much, much older in fact. Silver-threaded dark hair, eyes the colour of deep winter water, pale, clear, and entirely without warmth toward anything that had just tried to threaten the woman in this clearing. He was lean in the way of things built for endurance, not display, yet he carried the particular stillness of something that has not been in a hurry in a very long time and sees no reason to start now. The 3 rogues looked at him. Then they left. Quickly, with the body language of wolves who had just revised their understanding of the situation entirely. The man turned to Selenova. He looked at her with an expression she could not name at first. Not threat. Not pity. Something older and more specific than either. Recognition. "You held your ground," he said. His voice was the kind of low that carried without effort. Against 3 wolves you had no real chance of defeating. She shifted back. She was tired and cold, and her hands were shaking slightly from adrenaline, and she was not going to apologize for any of those things. Running would have been worse. Yes. He looked at her steadily. And something in you already knew that. That is not a learned quality. A pause. It is an inherited one. Selenova looked at him. "Who are you?" "My name is Erix Wolfhart," he said. "I have been in these mountains for 23 years, and you are the first person in all that time that I have been waiting for." He turned and began walking north along the ridge. "Come inside. You are cold, and you have not eaten properly in 2 days, and what I have to tell you will be easier with fire." She stood in the clearing for a moment. Then she followed him. His cave was behind the great waterfall on the mountain's interior face, the one she had heard from a distance for 2 days without finding. The sound of the water covered the entrance completely. Inside, it opened into 3 connected chambers, the largest of which had a fire going, a stone table covered in documents and rough maps, and a shelf of books so old their spines had lost their titles. He fed her first. He did not speak while she ate. That alone told her something about the kind of person he was. Then he sat across the fire from her and told her what she was. He did it carefully, without embellishment, The way someone tells a story they have had 2 centuries to consider and have still not entirely made peace with. The Starborn bloodline. Wolves born with the ability to perceive emotional truth, not instinct, not intuition, but actual sight. The ability to feel the bonds between wolves as tangible things, with color and texture and weight. The ability, in rare cases, to look at a marking between 2 wolves and see plainly whether it was real, whether it grew from genuine love and choice, or whether it was constructed from obligation and fear and held together by politics and pressure. The wolf councils had declared the bloodline extinct 2 centuries ago, not because the Starborn had done anything wrong, not because they were dangerous in the way of violence or destruction, because a wolf who could see the truth of every political arrangement was a threat to every political arrangement. Every alliance built on convenience rather than loyalty. Every marking agreed to for territory rather than love. Every council vote influenced by pressure rather than principle. A Starborn wolf could look at all of it and see it plainly, the way the rest of the world sees color, simply, clearly, but without being able to pretend otherwise. The bloodline was not extinguished. That, Eryx said, was the lie the councils told themselves, and eventually came to believe. It was hidden, scattered, dispersed across generations into families who had learned to bury what they carried, presenting as the child who always knew when adults were keeping secrets, the healer whose patience recovered without quite understanding why, the wolf who could find grief in a room before anyone in the room had spoken it aloud. Seleneva sat with it. It was the experience of having every strange, isolated, unexplainable thing about yourself suddenly assigned a name. The headmistress at the settlement house in the northern reaches, who had flinched, consistently, always, when Seleneva looked at her directly, who had called it impertinence when it was something she could not quite defend against, the horses that had followed her to the fence of every farm she had ever worked at, the way she had always known, always without fail, when someone offering comfort did not mean it, when sympathy was performance, when kindness was negotiation, when love was politics wearing warmer clothes. The bond with Kyrox. How vivid it had been from the first night. How much more real it had felt than anything she had ever heard a bond described as. How she had attributed it to the particular nature of who he was to her, and never once considered that the vividness was on her end. That she was feeling it more completely than most wolves could feel anything. That she was Starborn. There was a woman, Eryx said at the end, as with the quietness of a man reciting something he has kept inside for a long time. 2 centuries ago, she sat before the Elder Council and told them what she saw in the bonds between them. Not accusations, just truth. What was loyalty and what was arrangement? What was love and what was useful affection? She was the last Starborn to speak openly. After that, they voted to erase the bloodline. He looked at the fire. They didn't succeed. They only drove it underground. Seleneva sat with it for a very long time. She looked at the bond, at the place in her chest where it connected, dim now through the wall she had been building stone by stone since the night of the ceremony, but present, persistent, refusing to go silent regardless of how deliberately she had been trying not to feel it. "Can you teach me to use it?" she said. Eryx looked at her. Something in his expression shifted. The long, careful patience of a man who has been waiting for a specific question from a specific person, and has finally, after 23 years, heard it. "That," he said, "is why I asked you to stay." Day 7. Kyrox had lost the scent trail near the northern river. The Thornvale's interior waterways were old and fast and deep, the kind of rivers that moved through landscape like they owned it and were not particularly interested in what was trying to track whom across their banks. The trail, sharp and clear through the lower mountain slopes, carrying the particular scent he would have known out of 10,000 others, dissolved completely at the eastern bank and did not reassemble on either side. His trackers, 12 of the best wolves in the territory, at wolves who had found lost travelers in complete darkness, wolves who had tracked across rain-soaked plains and snow-covered ridges, had found nothing after 2 days of searching the area. The fortress, meanwhile, had noticed. Of course it had. Fortresses always noticed. The Whispers were already moving through every corridor with the efficiency of smoke finding cracks in stone. The Alpha King had left his newly marked mate at the ceremony celebration and gone into the mountains alone. The Alpha King was searching for the Healer's Apprentice. The Healer's Apprentice had done something to the bond, manipulated it, influenced it, used abilities that nobody could quite name, but that sounded, in the retelling, increasingly sinister. The girl was dangerous. The girl had enchanted him. Of the girl needed to be found and brought before the Elder Council. The girl. Kyrox stood in the outer courtyard in the grey morning light and listened to the whispers without expression, and understood with a cold clarity that Velor had anticipated all of this, that this was the third and final layer of the trap, not just removing Seleneva, but shaping the story of her removal, so that if she came back into a space that had already been poisoned against her. Velor had not simply moved against her because of her relationship with Kyrox. He had moved against her because of what she was. Zorina Ravencrest said nothing publicly. She moved through the fortress with the quiet dignity of a woman who was choosing, deliberately, not to perform in either direction, not pretending everything was normal, while not feeding the Whispers with visible distress. Kyrox respected this more than he could articulate. She had entered this arrangement in good faith, told she was making an alliance and a marking, and had instead been placed in the center of a situation she hadn't consented to. She deserved better than what she had been given. He would find a way to make it right. But first, he had to find Seleneva. Nerea came to Arixen on the morning of the 8th day. She was 18, a fortress attendant who worked the servant passages of the lower residential floors, and she had the look of someone who had been carrying something heavy for longer than they wanted to. She found Arixen in the guard anteroom and stood in the doorway for a moment before coming in, as if she were giving herself one final chance to leave. She stayed. She had seen Zarel Grimwood in the servants' passage on the morning of the ceremony, the passage that ran behind the lower healery wing. She had been holding a folded piece of parchment with a wax seal. Nerea recognized the wax seal because she worked in the residential floors and she had seen it many times. The Alpha's personal seal, the one kept in the private writing room on the 2nd residential level. Zareli had pressed it herself. Nerea had watched her, through the latticed passage screen, press the seal ring into the cooling wax on the folded letter with the focused care of someone completing something they had been preparing for a very long time. Zareli should not have had access to that seal ring. She had not simply borrowed it. To take the Alpha's personal seal from the locked writing room required access to the room, knowledge of where the seal was kept, and enough time to do it without being observed. None of those things happened accidentally. Arixen brought it to Kyrox within the hour. Kyrox read the information in silence. He sat with it, the way he sat with things that were very heavy and required stillness before response. The particular stillness of someone who learned early that his first reaction to devastating news was rarely the reaction the situation needed. Then he went to find Velor. For the last time. Velor was in the Eastern Advisory Chamber, as he almost always was. The lamp was burning. The maps were spread. He looked up when Kyrox entered, and something in his face did the calculation that very intelligent people perform when they understand that a conversation they have been preparing for has arrived earlier than expected. He set down his pen. Kyrox closed the door. He sat, a deliberate choice, because sitting said I have time for this, and having time for something was more frightening than anger. He looked at Vaylor across the table, covered in the work of 3 decades of management and strategy and careful influence. "The letter," he said. "My lord." She believed I wrote it. Kyrox's voice was even. She walked out of this fortress, believing I had decided, quietly and deliberately, that she was a problem I no longer wanted to carry. A pause. She took the sage I left at her window. She left everything else. And she took that. He looked at Vaylor with something that was not anger. Anger had a heat to it that this did not. This was colder and more permanent. She is somewhere in those mountains right now, believing I chose this. Vaylor straightened. He used the voice of a man who has spent 30 years being the most reasonable person in the room and has never once stopped believing it. I acted to protect the territory. A star-born wolf in the Alpha's marking is not simply a political inconvenience. It is a structural threat to every alliance this pack has maintained for a generation. She could see through every bond in the territory. "Every arrangement we have, every arrangement you have," Kyrox said quietly. Vaylor stopped. The fabricated council vote, the forged letter, the deliberate removal of a woman whose bloodline you found in the oldest pack records and chose to eliminate before she could learn what she was. Kyrox leaned forward slightly. "You built a cage from my love for her, and you used it to send her into the mountains alone." He held the silence for a moment. "But that is not service, Vaylor. It is the worst kind of betrayal, the kind that dresses itself in loyalty so carefully that the person being betrayed holds the door open." Vaylor said nothing. Kyrox stood. "You are removed from your position. You will be off these grounds by dawn." He walked out. He went to the private writing room. Alone. He sat at the desk, where the seal ring had been taken from, without his knowledge, and used to close a letter that had been written to send the person he loved out into the cold, believing she was unwanted. He sat with that for a long time. Then he found parchment. He wrote. Not carefully, not with the managed precision he applied to official communications. He wrote the way you write something, when you know the person reading it will be able to feel whether every word is true. What he wrote the truth, all of it, including the parts that did not reflect well on him. The fabricated vote that he had accepted without demanding the original record. The ceremony he had attended out of fear for her, which had become its own kind of harm. The choices he had made believing he was protecting her, that had resulted in her standing alone in a mountain range, thinking she had been discarded. He did not frame it to make himself seem better than he was. He folded the letter and held it in both hands. In the morning, he would go back into the mountains, and this time he would not come back without her. She was getting better at seeing. Not the bond that she had always felt, with the vivid, overwhelming immediacy that she now understood was her inheritance, but the broader sight, that the ability Eryx was teaching her to use deliberately, the way you learn to use a sense you had always had but never understood, was separate from the others. She could feel the bonds between the mountain animals now, the particular warmth between the hawk pair that nested above the upper cave, and the way it carried something she could only describe as certainty. She could walk through the lower forest and sense, in the absence of other wolves, the emotional residue that things left in spaces. Grief, in the clearing where Eryx had buried his mate 40 years ago. Warmth, in the cave entrance, where he had clearly spent decades arriving home to something he loved. She was learning, carefully. With the focused attention, she gave everything she decided to do. The bond with Kyrox she kept behind the wall. The wall was there for her survival, not her denial. She was not pretending. She was not telling herself it was over. She was simply not able to function with the full weight of it open. Not yet. Not until she knew what she was going to do with the knowledge that had changed the shape of her entire understanding of herself. At night, she pressed her hand to her chest and felt it, dim, muffled through stone, but not silent. It was never silent. It did not know how to be. And sometimes, in the deepest hours, she felt something from the other side of it. Not words, not images, just a quality. Presence, intention. Something pouring warmth toward her through a mountain range with the particular focus of a person who has decided they will simply keep doing this until it lands. She told herself it was projection. She was not entirely convincing herself. Eric's found her at the cave entrance on the 19th morning, looking down the mountain slope with an expression he had learned, in the weeks since she arrived, meant she was having an argument with herself about something, and was close to a decision. "He is coming," Eric said. She did not look surprised. She had felt the bond shift direction 2 days ago, the warmth no longer simply present but moving, steady and purposeful, approaching. She had not told Eric's. "I know," she said. "What do you want to do?" She looked at the valley below them for a long moment. The question was honest, and she gave it the honesty it deserved. She thought about the woman who had folded her apron and counted her breaths and walked out through the eastern gate. She thought about the letter she had received. She thought about all the things she now knew, and all the things she still did not know. "I want to know," she said finally, "if what I felt through the bond was the truth, all of it." A pause. "Not what he tells me. What I can see." Eric's nodded. "Then open your sight," he said, "and let him come." He came alone. Kyrox walked the path up the mountain's interior face with the particular quality of a man who has been moving toward something for 19 days and has arrived at the state that is beyond urgency, beyond desperation, the steady, quiet certainty of a person who is going to do this thing regardless of how it resolves. He was damp from the waterfall mist. He looked exhausted in the specific way of someone who had not slept with intention in weeks. Not dramatically, not broken, just the honest accumulation of days on end of pushing forward without stopping. But he wore no formal anything. Dark traveling clothes. His hair still wet. Nothing performed. He stopped at the cave entrance. He did not call out. He stood in the cold mist and waited. Eric's appeared first. He looked at Kyrox with those pale winter water eyes, the same look he had given the rogues in the clearing 3 weeks ago, the assessment of a very old wolf reading a very specific situation. He looked for a long time. "She is not here," Eric's said. "I am not asking to take her anywhere," Kyrox said. "I am asking to be heard." He held up the folded letter. "If she will not hear it from me, give her this." Eric's regarded him for another moment. Then he stepped aside. Selenova read the letter in the small inner cave behind the falls. She read it once, quickly, the way you read something when your hands have already started shaking. Then she sat with it for a moment. Then she read it again, more slowly. Then again. The parchment was creased at the folds in the way of something written and reconsidered and written again. She could feel the history of it in the paper, the places where ink had been pressed harder in moments of feeling. It was not a neat letter. It was not a managed letter. She opened her star-born sight, fully, for the first time since the night of the ceremony. She reached toward the bond, past the wall, stone by stone, one layer at a time, and she felt his grief, heavy and real and utterly unperformed, the grief of someone who has been carrying something since the night it happened and has not put it down. His guilt. A specific kind, not the guilt of someone constructing a version of events designed to minimize their own responsibility, but the guilt of a man looking at the direct consequences of choices he made and refusing to look away from them. his fear. Thin and constant, running underneath everything like cold water under ice. Not the fear of consequences, the fear of a person standing outside a door in the cold, holding something fragile, hoping the door will open. And beneath all of it, steady, continuous, requiring nothing, simply present the way warmth is present. Love. Not asking to be forgiven. Not asking for anything. Just there. She sat with it for a long time. Then she stood. She walked back through the narrow passage to the main cave entrance, past Eric's, who was sitting at his stone table with the deliberate composure of someone who is giving a situation the space it requires. Kyrox was still there, standing in the waterfall mist, with the letter already delivered, and nothing left to offer except himself, which was the most any person ever has to give, and the thing most people find hardest to trust. He looked at her. He did not move toward her. He held the distance she was holding, steady, and let her close it, or not close it, as she chose. "I am not asking you to forgive me tonight," he said. "I am asking you to let me stay." Selenova looked at him for a long moment. Her sight was still open. She read every thread of what she saw. Then she stepped back from the entrance. "Come inside," she said. "You look like the mountain tried to keep you." Something moved across his face. She felt it through the bond before she saw it. Relief, and the specific quality past relief, or the expression that belongs to a person who stepped forward, expecting the ground to give way, and found it holding. He came inside. They sat by Eric's fire for a long time that night, long after Eric's had disappeared into the back chamber, with the tact of someone who understood that certain conversations require their own walls. They talked. Not quickly. Not easily. With the particular care of two people building something back from its foundation, checking each stone before they place it, not in a hurry because a hurry is how you miss the cracks. He told her everything. She listened with her sight open, not to catch him in something, but because she had learned in these 3 weeks that open sight was not a weapon. It was simply the truth, available to be seen, and the truth about what she saw as he spoke was that he was not managing her, or he was simply there, telling her what happened, including the parts that made him small. She told him what she was. She watched him receive it, the star-born bloodline, the sight, all of it. She watched him sit with it, not as a problem, but as information. His first response was not, "What does this mean for me?" His first response was something that read, through the bond, like wonder. Like someone looking at a thing they had always known was real but had never had language for, and being given the language. "You always knew," he said slowly, "when I was managing you, when I wasn't." "Yes," she said, "and you still—" He stopped. He looked at the fire. "You stayed. Because what was real, she said, regardless of what was complicated about it. The bond settled between them, warmth to warmth, gold to gold, or in the specific way of something that has been thin and strained and stretched past its limit, returning, slowly, to its natural state. She did not knock down the rest of the wall that night. She took it apart, stone by stone, the way she had built it, carefully, on her own terms, at a pace she controlled. By morning there was nothing left of it. They came back through the front gate, not through a side entrance, not at night, not quietly. In the full, clear light of a late autumn morning, with Ericson, Shadowfang, and 6 of the guard walking behind them, and the fortress courtyard finding reasons, one by one, to stop what it was doing and simply look. Nerea had been waiting at the inner gate with a deep green travelling cloak and a look on her face that said she had been waiting since before dawn and was not apologizing for it. Or she pressed the cloak into Selenova's hands and squeezed them once, not words, just warmth, and then stepped back into her proper place. Simple, well-made, dark green. Nothing ceremonial, nothing designed to impress. Just right, the way things are right when they are honest. By midday, the great hall was full. Every noble family, every council elder, every person of consequence in the Stormclaw territories gathered with the anxious, close-held energy of wolves who understand something significant is arriving and have not yet determined which direction to lean. They clustered near their families. They spoke in low voices. They watched the main doors. The doors opened. Kyrox walked in without theatre, without the performance of authority that was his usual currency in formal spaces. Or he walked at a pace that said everything he had to say would be said clearly and needed no choreography. And Selenova walked beside him, not behind him, not at a careful ceremonial distance, beside him. And the sound in the hall shifted, the way a held breath shifts into silence. He stopped at the center of the hall. He did not use the dais. He did not use the raised platform that placed him above the room. He stood on the same floor as every person in that hall, and spoke. I am going to tell you what happened. Not the version that was moving through this fortress. The truth. The hall was quiet. The kind of quiet that is not silence, but the holding of it. 300 wolves and more, all choosing, in this specific moment, not to interrupt. He named Valor Grimwood. He named Zarella. He laid out everything, the fabricated ultimatum, and the council vote that never existed in the form it was presented. The seal ring taken from his private room, the letter written in a hand not his own, and used to send a woman walking out of the fortress, believing she had been deliberately discarded. He did not raise his voice. He did not use the heightened formality of official accusation. He laid it out the way you lay evidence on a table, piece by piece, plainly, trusting the truth to carry its own weight without embellishment. Then he told them what Selenova was. This territory declared the Starborn bloodline extinct 2 centuries ago, he said. He let that sentence live in the air for a moment. It was not extinct. It was hidden, because it frightened the people in power enough that they chose erasure over accountability. He turned slightly, toward where Valor would have stood if Valor had not already been removed from the grounds. When my former high strategist found evidence of her bloodline in the oldest pack records, he did not bring it to me. He moved against her. Because a wolf who can see the truth of every bond in this territory is not a threat to this territory. She is a threat to every political arrangement that has been passed off as loyalty, while being held together with obligation and fear. The hall was still, a different kind of still now, the stillness of people hearing something they had, in various ways, been aware of without knowing they were aware of it. Kyrox turned to Zorina Ravencrest. She was standing with her family in the 3rd row, composed and direct. She had the look of someone who has been managing a difficult situation with dignity for 3 weeks, and is now watching it finally resolve in the direction she had quietly suspected it needed to go. Zorina Ravencrest entered this arrangement in good faith, Kyrox said. She was told she was participating in an alliance and a marking. She was not told she was being used as an instrument in a manipulation she had no knowledge of and no part in designing. Her family's honor is untouched. Her integrity in this situation has been, throughout, above reproach. He looked at her. She met his gaze, not with gratitude, not with relief, just steadiness. The gaze of a person who did not need to be praised, only accurately seen. Then he turned to Selenova. The hall went completely still. This is Seleneva Ashenvale. His voice was clear and carrying, the kind of voice that didn't need volume because it had conviction underneath it. She has no pack name, because no pack has yet deserved to give her one. She is Starborn, a bloodline this territory declared extinct out of fear, and will now have the responsibility of learning to deserve. A pause, short and deliberate. She is my mate, my choice, and from this day forward, she stands beside me. From the back of the hall, a single pair of hands began to applaud. Arixon Shadowfang, captain of the guard, 11 years in service, a man who expressed feeling approximately once per decade and was clearly choosing to spend this one now, clapping with the kind of real, unhurried, the two-handed energy of someone who has been quietly hoping for one specific outcome for a very long time and is enormously relieved to have arrived at it. The sound grew, not all at once, not without hesitation, but it grew, spreading from the guard posts outward into the General Assembly, gathering momentum as it went, the sound of a room deciding, one person at a time, that this was the version of the world it wanted to live in. Seleneva stood in the center of the great hall. The sound surrounded her. The bond glowed in her chest like a held flame, warm and steady, and nothing like the direction it had been pointing on the night she had folded her apron and walked out through the eastern gate. She let herself feel it. She let herself stay. The weeks after were slow and necessary, or the fortress restructured itself the way living things heal, not quickly, not without cost, but genuinely. Velor was gone. The position he had occupied for 3 decades was not filled by a single replacement. Kyrox built a council from honesty rather than family alignment, smaller, more diverse, chosen for people who had demonstrated, over time, the willingness to say the difficult thing rather than the useful one. Erix Wolfhart arrived at the fortress 3 weeks after the Hall Declaration. He came with 2 bags, a long list of conditions, and the composed skepticism of a man who had been living in a mountain cave for 23 years and was not convinced that civilization had improved in his absence. He was given a tower room on the eastern wing. He installed himself in it and proceeded to be consistently, precisely, and usefully inconvenient. On his 3rd day, he told Kyrox without preamble that the 3rd-tier council appointment Kyrox had just approved was a mistake because the man in question made decisions designed to appear loyal rather than decisions designed to produce good outcomes, which were not the same thing. Kyrox had looked at him. "How do you know?" "I watched how he spoke about his previous lord in the first conversation we had," Erix said. "A man who performed devotion to a king he served and disliked will perform devotion to you and dislike you too. The performance is the pattern, not the loyalty." A pause. "You will tell me when I'm wrong," Kyrox said. "Frequently," Erix said. "I won't enjoy it." "No," Erix said. "But you will be better for it. We understand each other." He annulled the appointment. Seleneva's work was different. That it was quieter, and it was larger, and it started the way all the most important things start, with one conversation. She found a letter in the correspondence stack 3 weeks after returning to the fortress, from an outlying settlement 3 days' ride north. A woman writing about her daughter, 12 years old, bright and strange, and completely unable to explain why she always knew when adults were lying to each other, which had made her childhood difficult in the specific way of children who see more than the adults around them want seen. The mother was not writing for a diagnosis. She was writing because someone in the settlement had heard about what was said in the Great Hall, and the mother thought. She was not sure. She did not want to assume. But she thought perhaps her daughter was not simply strange. Seleneva wrote back the same evening. Then another letter arrived, and another. From different settlements, different corners of the territory, different generations. The grandmother who had spent 60 years quietly reading the bonds between everyone she loved, and never told a soul because she had no language for it. The young guard who could track grief across a campsite without scent. The healer in the border town whose patients always recovered, slightly faster than could be attributed to her technique. She wrote to all of them, She visited the closest settlements with Arixon as company, who turned out to be, beneath the composed, an unhurried exterior, someone who found the entire enterprise quietly extraordinary and showed it primarily by being very efficient about travel logistics and occasionally asking questions he framed as practical, but which were clearly personal. On the third trip, riding back along the river road in the late afternoon light, he said, without preamble, "My youngest sister always knew when I was lying." Seleneva looked at him. "Did she?" I told myself she was intuitive. A pause. "She is 32 now, lives in the eastern settlement. I am going to write to her." "I'll send the letter with yours," Seleneva said. He nodded once. That was, for Arixon Shadowfang, the equivalent of a long and emotional speech. Zorina came on a grey afternoon in the fourth week. She appeared in the doorway of the small study, where Seleneva was working through correspondence, standing with the composed posture of someone who has rehearsed this approach and is executing it with every available piece of nerve. She was alone. She had not sent word first. "May I come in?" she said. "Yes," Seleneva said. She set down her pen. Zorina came in. She did not sit immediately. She stood near the window with the careful stillness of someone choosing their words with real precision. Not diplomatic precision, but honest precision, which is harder and rarer. "I wanted to say that I did not know about the bond," she said. "I was told I was entering an alliance marking with an Alpha King who had no prior mate claim. I believed that. And I was glad to be chosen. I will not pretend otherwise, because pretending otherwise would be its own kind of lie." She looked at Seleneva directly. But I knew something was wrong. There were small things across the 3 weeks between the announcement and the ceremony. The way he never looked west. The way people in the lower corridors went quiet when certain conversations started. I did not ask the questions that would have told me how wrong. A pause. That is not the same as being innocent. Seleneva looked at her for a long moment. Her sight was open. She kept it open most of the time now, the way you keep a lamp burning in a room you work in, because the darkness is simply harder to work in. She read Zorina's face. Not performance, not political damage management, not the careful construction of a narrative designed to restore a reputation. Just a young woman sitting with the specific discomfort of someone who has looked honestly at a situation they were partly responsible for and found themselves wanting. "Sit down," Seleneva said. "There is tea if you want it." They talked for an hour. It was not easy. It was not the beginning of a simple friendship. There were long silences that neither of them tried to fill with comfortable words, because comfortable words in a conversation like this are a form of dishonesty, and Seleneva's sight would have read that clearly, and Zorina, who was, Seleneva was beginning to understand, considerably more perceptive than the situation she had been placed in, gave her room to demonstrate, would have known it too. But when Zorina left, and the room held her absence in the particular way of someone who has taken something real out of a space rather than something performed, Seleneva sat for a moment with what the conversation had been: honest, imperfect, necessary, the only kind worth having. 6 months after the ceremony, late autumn again, Kyrox could not sleep. He had not been sleeping well for most of the week since the mountain, not badly, not with the exhausted, pursued quality of the 19 days of searching, but with the light restlessness of a person whose body is not yet entirely convinced that the thing they were afraid of losing is genuinely here and staying. He would wake at the 4th hour and lie in the dark, listening to the bond, and it was always warm and present and steady, and he would settle, and then he would wake again. He went to the lower healery without planning to. Old instinct, the memory path of the past year, leading him to the one room in the fortress where someone had ever asked him to be a person rather than a king. He expected it to be dark and empty at this hour. The lamp was burning. Selenova was at the workbench with her sleeves rolled up and her hair loosely gathered, and the stone mortar in her hands, grinding something that smelled sharp and green. Thorn root, he thought. The same thing she had been grinding the night everything happened, and the symmetry of this was not lost on him, and clearly not lost on her, either because, when she looked up, there was something in her expression that acknowledged it without making a speech about it. "Couldn't sleep," he said. "I never could," she said, or she turned to the small fire and put the kettle on without being asked. Another symmetry, 6 months in the other direction, a kettle put on in a room that felt safe. She leaned against the bench across from him and looked at him with the easy attention that she gave things she was not managing or performing for, just present, just him. He sat on the workbench, the same workbench where it had all started. The quiet between them had the specific texture of something that requires nothing from either person, not filling, not performing, not managing, just warmth in a small room at a late hour. She set a cup beside him. He wrapped both hands around it. "Are you happy?" he asked. He would always ask. He understood now that this was something in him that would not be quiet. The need to check, but not because he doubted, but because he had spent too long in a world where people's real states were hidden behind what was expected of them, and he would not assume. He would ask, every time, for as long as she let him. Selenova held her cup in both hands and looked at the fire. She thought about the word. Happy. What it covered and what it missed. She thought about the woman who had folded an apron in a small room and walked into the cold, believing she was unwanted. She thought about a mountain waterfall and a silver-haired wolf with winter eyes, and the morning she had learned to name herself. She thought about a letter, read by firelight with her sight fully open, feeling grief and guilt and love threaded through every word, and the choice, stone by stone, to let something real back in. She thought about the correspondence stacked on her desk, the letters from the settlements, the woman with the daughter, the grandmother who had kept her sight in silence for 60 years, and wept in her response, with what seemed to be primarily relief at having language for what she had always been. She thought about Eriksson saying, "I am going to write to her," and meaning it. She thought about Eriks in his tower room, inconvenient and necessary, and, she suspected, more settled in himself than he had been in 23 years of mountain solitude. She thought about a great hall and the sound of one pair of hands beginning. She looked at Kyrox. "I am home," she said. "That is better than happy. It lasts longer." He reached across the space between them and took her hand. His grip was warm and unhurried. Not desperate. Nothing performed. Nothing held too tight. Simply present. The way warmth is present. The way the bond had been present on the night it formed when neither of them had been looking for it. Outside, the Thornvale Mountains rose in the distance, dark against a sky full of stars. The same mountains she had walked into, believing she was finished. The same mountains she had learned, in cold and quiet and firelit caves, what she was. She opened her sight. The bond between them glowed, visible to her in the way that very few things in the world are visible to most people, with a clarity and a color and a texture that carried its entire history in its light. Not the dim, strained, wall-muffled thread of the mountain weeks. Not the pale, stretched distance of 19 days, and a letter and a waterfall. Nothing like the shifted, redirected warmth she had felt in the healery when her hand stopped mid-motion, and she had pressed her palm to her chest and known. Gold. Steady. warm from edge to edge with no grey remaining. Not perfect, the way real things are not perfect. But real, the way perfect things almost never are. She curled her fingers around his. The fire crackled in the grate. The kettle breathed steam in slow, easy plumes. Outside the window, the stars were very clear over the thorn veil. The same stars she had looked up at from the first ridge on the night she walked through the eastern gate, cold and alone and finished. The stars that had been simply cold then, and were something else now. Something she did not quite have a word for in any of the languages she had ever learned. Witnessed, perhaps. Held. The bond glowed gold in the dark, as the night held them, and in the Stormclaw territories, under a king who had learned, at cost and in full, the difference between the performance of a good choice and the actual making of one. Things were changing. Not quickly. Not without the scar tissue of what had been done wrong. But genuinely, the way real change always moves, through honesty, through the willingness to look at difficult things directly, through people choosing truth when every easier option was available. Slowly. Imperfectly. Real. Selenova pressed her palm once to the center of her chest, where the bond lived, and felt it pulse against her hand, warm and present and entirely unbreakable. She had been told her bloodline was extinct. She had been told she was nobody. She had been told that what lived between her and the Alpha King in the small, or warm hours of a healery would not survive the daylight of a public world. Every one of those things had been wrong, and honesty, the only foundation in the end that actually holds anything, had known it from the beginning.